Thank you all for coming today. We're pleased to have with us Ambassador Phil Wilcox. He entered the Foreign Service in 1966 and has served abroad in Laos, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. His last overseas assignment was as Chief of Mission and U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem. In the Department of State, his assignments included Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research, and Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism. In 2002, Wilcox received a Distinguished Service Award from Americans for Peace Now, and in 2004, he received the Louis B. Schoen Human Rights Award from the UN Association National Capital Area. He is a great friend of CMEP, and he's on our advisory council. Please welcome Phil Wilcox.
Thank you to Churches for Middle East Peace, and thank all of you for coming to this conference on the Holy City of Jerusalem. There is no more important issue, in my view, to peace in the Middle East than a resolution of the conflict over Jerusalem. The city is of holy significance to the three great faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. It is the political heart of the State of Israel and of the potential state of Palestine. Is a city that has been fraught with conflict for 2 millennia, yet it is still a symbol of hope and peace to people around the world. So there's a desperate need to address the problem of Jerusalem, and it's a very commendable initiative that Churches for Middle East Peace has taken to try to spread understanding and information about Jerusalem and to help mobilize all of you to spread the word around the country. The United States encounter with the city of Jerusalem, indeed with the Middle East, is relatively new. We, unlike the European colonial powers, we had little exposure to the Middle East until the mid-20th century. We had no colonial adventures there. We had no military involvement except for brief skirmishes with the Barbary pirates in the 19th century. We did have American Christian missionaries in the Middle East, and we established some wonderful educational institutions there back in the 19th century. The American University of Beirut, the American University of Cairo, Roberts College in Istanbul. So it was largely our missionary presence in the 19th century that tied the two countries together. The political involvement, the strategic involvement came much, much later. The U.S., nevertheless, did establish a diplomatic mission in Jerusalem in the 1870s. In those days, as you know, Jerusalem was governed by Ottoman Turkey as part of the vast Ottoman Turkish Empire. And Jerusalem was a rather small and sleepy city, but it was a city of tremendous historic and religious importance, and it was a city of pilgrimage for American Christians and other Christians around the world. So we had a consulate there, and its primary duties were to work with Christian pilgrims and to help Americans who got in trouble. We established our consulate, first of all, in the old city of Jerusalem. And those of you who know the old city, if you go through the Jaffa Gate, our consulate was right there on the second story of a building that today is a falafel shop. The consulate moved several times throughout its history. Today it is located on Egron Road in West Jerusalem in an old Ottoman mansion, and the consulate also has an adjunct on Nablus Road in East Jerusalem. The American colony is another American legend in Jerusalem. This was a colony of American and Swedish Christians who went to Jerusalem to help work with poor Palestinians. Today, the American colony is a hotel in East Jerusalem in a magnificent old Arab palace. If you visit Jerusalem, be sure to visit the American Colony Hotel. Well, things changed radically after World War II. As you know, the State of Israel was created. There was a great war between Arab armies, Palestinian militias, and Israel emerged victorious in 1948, having declared its independence. The State of Israel, as you know, was a product of the Zionist national movement. Zionism itself was a response to hundreds and hundreds of years of Christian persecution of the Jews. The Jewish people felt they needed a state of their own where they could live as normal people, and so that was the birth of Zionism, ultimately led to support by the United Kingdom in the Balfour Declaration, which supported a Zionist home in Palestine. The Zionists chose Palestine because that was the site of the ancient Jewish kingdoms. In the 1920s, there was a growing level of immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Europe, who came under British protection. The British had invaded and occupied Palestine and became the League of Nations mandatory power there in 1917. The city of Jerusalem was not divided then. It was a united city, and the consulate continued to represent American interests in Jerusalem. The 1948 war changed that because Israel occupied West Jerusalem and ultimately established its capital there. East Jerusalem remained in Jordanian hands, and a wall was built through the middle of the city. We maintained our consulate in West Jerusalem, but we also had the old office in East Jerusalem, and every day the American consulate would cross through the wall to visit the other side of his consular domain. The Americans retained our embassy, established our embassy to the new state of Israel in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem, and as did almost all other foreign governments that established diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. We did that for a very important reason. Because of the sanctity of Jerusalem, its international importance, its religious significance to people of all faiths, we did not accept Israel's sovereignty in Jerusalem. And when the Israeli government moved its capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, we did not move our embassy. We preserved our embassy in Tel Aviv, and it remains there today. The consulate in Jerusalem, by design, is not part of the American embassy. It's an independent diplomatic mission. It reports directly to the Secretary of State, not to the American ambassador in Tel Aviv. We've maintained the independence of the consulate as a symbol of our commitment to a diplomatic resolution of the problem of Jerusalem and our unwillingness to accept Israel's unilateral claim of sovereignty over the city. That is still our doctrine. Now, in 1967, things changed further. You recall in 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel occupied the West Bank, the Sinai Desert, the Golan Heights, and also East Jerusalem, which between 1948 and 1967 had been part of Jordan, and there was a wall separating East and West Jerusalem. The wall came down, and the Israelis invaded and occupied East Jerusalem, but they also vastly expanded the boundaries of East Jerusalem. And that created this new Israeli doctrine of united, eternal Jewish Jerusalem. And that is the doctrine that all Israeli governments have pursued ever since. they claim the exclusive right to all of Jerusalem, east and west. They claim that it has always been a Jewish city. It is theirs, and they will not compromise over Jerusalem. That is historically, of course, unrealistic, because whereas there has been a continuous Jewish presence in the city of Jerusalem since the Romans, since the Jewish kingdoms, and even after the Romans expelled the Jews from the Holy Land in the 2nd century, a group of Jews continued to exist in Jerusalem, in the city of Safat in Israel, and in Hebron in the West Bank. But for those intervening hundreds and hundreds of years, Jerusalem was first a Christian city under the Byzantines. Then it became a Muslim city in the 8th century after the Muslim conquest of the Holy Land and virtually all of the rest of the Middle East. So there was a long, long history of Arab and Islamic sovereignty in Jerusalem. And today, these two communities, as well as the Christian world, maintains a strong claim to Jerusalem. Jerusalem cannot be owned by one state, by one religion. Jerusalem is the patrimony and the heritage of the peoples of the world of all three faiths. Well, we did not accept the Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem. We maintained our doctrine that the city had the status of the city had to be resolved through negotiations, as we do today. We preserved the independence of our consulate general in Jerusalem and maintained our embassy in Tel Aviv. Well, the results of this in practical terms, in fact, are rather bizarre, because almost all of the ministries of the government of Israel are in Jerusalem, and the American ambassador and his staff from Tel Aviv have to drive up to Jerusalem every day to do business there, and then return back to their embassy in Tel Aviv. The consulate, which represents the United States in Jerusalem, has no diplomatic relations with the government of Israel. The government of Israel objects to the consulate. They resent it as a symbol of the American policy that Jerusalem remains to be negotiated. And the U.S. unwillingness to accept Israel's unilateral claim of sovereignty over all of Jerusalem. Well, this cult, and I call it a cult because it is historically incorrect, that Jerusalem has always been Jewish, that Israel and the Jewish people have an exclusive right to Jerusalem, grew stronger and stronger. In order to cement Israeli control in East Jerusalem after the '67 war, Israel developed very large Israeli settlements and moved about 200,000 Israeli Jews into East Jerusalem in an effort to create a Jewish demographic majority throughout the entire city. That experiment has not succeeded because the Arab population of Jerusalem, now over 200,000, East Jerusalem, is growing much more rapidly than the Jewish population. So effectively there are two cities today. There is the Jewish Israeli city in West Jerusalem, where virtually all of the inhabitants are Israeli Jews. And in East Jerusalem, there are over 200,000 Arabs. East Jerusalem is profoundly Arab. It is the cultural, political, and economic capital of Palestine, although Palestine is not yet a state. This massive effort to try to create a Jewish united Jerusalem has not succeeded. Today it is still two cities. Indeed, Israelis who live in West Jerusalem seldom go to East Jerusalem. They regard it as alien territory. Psychologically, politically, it is part of a different country, notwithstanding these huge efforts to physically amalgamate the two sides of the city. Well, we have, as I say, preserved our doctrine that Jerusalem must be negotiated, but that policy has eroded over the years, and we have not, as a government, been very aggressive in trying to preserve the status quo in Jerusalem pending political negotiations to resolve its status. As Israel has built settlements there today, Israel is building a series of walls which cut off East Jerusalem from the Palestinian hinterland. All of this is being done to try to prevent a diplomatic, mutually acceptable solution in Jerusalem. While nominally we have opposed these unilateral Israeli efforts, we've not worked very hard to make our views heard, and the Israelis have had more or less carte blanche to do what they wish in East Jerusalem. That is unfortunate because the Jerusalem issue is at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and indeed the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And unless there is a mutually accepted solution to Jerusalem, this conflict is going to continue. So I hope that in the future the U.S. will pursue its policy in Jerusalem much more vigorously. In recent years, although technically and legally the United States regards East Jerusalem as part of the occupied territories that Israel took in 1967, we seldom use the word occupied territory to describe East Jerusalem. In fact, when George H.W. Bush, the current president's father, used that word to describe East Jerusalem, there was a tremendous hue and cry from Jewish groups here in the U.S. and from the Israeli government. And so our politicians today do not describe East Jerusalem as occupied territory. It is surprisingly weak given, as I mentioned, the huge importance of Jerusalem to a negotiated solution to the larger issue of Israel and Palestine. A solution to the larger issue, as you all know, lies in the creation of two states, a sovereign, independent, free, contiguous Palestinian state next to Israel in the territories Israel occupied in 1967, and this is most important, with its capital in East Jerusalem. There must be two states, but there must also be two capitals in Jerusalem. The Israeli capital, where it is now, in West Jerusalem, and a new capital of the state of Palestine in East Jerusalem. I think our government understands that, but it has done surprisingly little to pursue that policy with the government of Israel. We've been much too passive, and that has only encouraged Israeli governments over the years to try to cement their grip on Jerusalem and to prevent its negotiation as a key issue in an ultimate peace settlement. So this cult of Jerusalem has had a huge impact in this country. But surprisingly and fortunately, it is eroding among Israelis and Palestinians who have realized over the years that the experiment of dominating Jerusalem, the idea of united Jewish Jerusalem, has not succeeded. And that ultimately, if there is to be peace and two states, there must also be a division of Jerusalem and a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. That growing recognition among Israelis is reflected in frequent public opinion polls, and a very interesting survey that was made by the American scholar Jerome Siegel using Israeli and Palestinian pollsters demonstrated some years ago that the Israeli Jews in Jerusalem and Israel and the Palestinians in Palestine have different concepts of what Jerusalem is. What is most precious to each side are their holy sites. For the Jews, it is the Jewish quarter of the Old City. It is the subsurface of the Temple Mount, where the ruins of the Second Temple lie. It is the Mount of Olives cemetery just on the east side of the old walled city. For the Muslims, the Arabs, the Palestinians, what is sacred in Jerusalem are the two holy mosques, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which lie on top of the Temple Mount. The Muslims, of course, call it the Haram al-Sharif. The Christian and the Muslim and the Armenian quarters of the old city. And when when the Israelis talk about Jerusalem, they're talking about something different than what the Palestinians are talking about. That's encouraging because it means that someday, with some wisdom and some courage, the issue of Jerusalem can be resolved in a way that meets the essential needs of both Israelis and Palestinians, of both Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Well, it hasn't happened. The U.S. did not address the issue of Jerusalem until very late in the Oslo peace process negotiations. You remember that we were reluctant to even mention Jerusalem because of the theory that it's too sensitive, it's too volatile, and so we didn't. It was the Israelis and Palestinians who finally brought up Jerusalem toward the end of the Oslo era, when at the Camp David summit in July 2000, to everyone's huge surprise, the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, started saying we can make a deal in Jerusalem. It showed that he had absorbed this, the reality that the old mythology about sacred united Jewish Jerusalem no longer held. So we had to kind of play catch-up ball. Our diplomats didn't know very much about Jerusalem, unfortunately, but they learned. And after the collapse of the summit, Bill Clinton came up with his own peace formula, the so-called Clinton parameters, and he said, Jerusalem can be solved. What is Arab shall be Arab. What is Jewish shall be Jewish. In other words, the city will be divided. The Jewish holy places, the Jewish residential neighborhoods, the places where the Jews live will become Jewish, Israeli Jerusalem. The Arab and Muslim holy sites, the residential areas, the downtown commercial Palestinian areas will be the capital of Palestine. So that was a real breakthrough. Unfortunately, Clinton's parameters, as they are called, were not adopted by the new government of George W. Bush, and the government of George W. Bush has said virtually nothing about Jerusalem. It has not renounced our doctrine that Jerusalem must be negotiated, but it has put no teeth into this doctrine. Now, how can this city, as a practical matter, be divided? How can there be two capitals in one city? It's not easy. But geographically and demographically, it can be done. As I mentioned, the Arabs live in their parts of the city, the Jews live in their parts of the city. The exception are these very large Israeli settlements that governments of Israel have built and fortified in Arab East Jerusalem. At the Camp David summit, you've probably heard that Yasser Arafat and his negotiators were stubborn. They offered no compromises whatsoever. In fact, they offered some major compromises, among them willingness to allow those Jewish settlements in East Jerusalem to merge into West Jerusalem and become part of Israel, if in return the Arabs and the Palestinians gain sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif, the Muslim holy sites, and the Arab residential neighborhoods of Jerusalem. So that was a real breakthrough. It is possible, and many books have been written about this, to have a kind of umbrella municipality which will provide electricity, public utilities to both the Palestinian populace and the Jewish populace of Jerusalem. That can be done. There can be a regime for the most sensitive holy place, that is the Temple Mount and the Haram al-Sharif. Under that regime, which has been widely discussed, the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, and the Jewish quarter of the Old City would become part of Israel, become part of West Jerusalem. The top of the Haram al-Sharif, or Temple Mount, would become part of the state of Palestine. The subsurface, where the ruins of the ancient temple lie, would be protected. There might be some kind of international regime that would help supervise this status quo. Some have suggested that that tiny area of the Temple Mount should have no sovereignty, that it should be declared that God is the sovereign in that very sensitive and precious area. Well, the bottom line is that Jerusalem remains a very sore point between the Israelis and the Palestinians, between the Israelis and the rest of the Muslim and Arab worlds, that there will be no peace, no two states, unless there is a similar resolution of Jerusalem whereby it becomes the capital of both the new state of Palestine, while West Jerusalem remains the capital of Israel. This would be a wonderful thing for both societies, in fact. Both would gain what they really need. For Jerusalem to be annexed by Israel, to be enclosed behind this massive barrier, a series of barriers that they are now building, is a catastrophe for the Palestinians, because not only is Jerusalem precious religiously and politically and culturally to the Palestinians and the Arab world, Jerusalem is the economic heart of the Palestinian economy. And so it is foolish this project to try to seal it off from Palestine would doom the prospect of a viable Palestinian state. Now, people say it's too late. With all the settlements, all the walls and barriers, it's too late. Too many facts on the ground that the situation is irreversible. I don't believe it. These are man-made facts. These facts can be undone politically, culturally. The West Bank and East Jerusalem are Palestinian and Arab. Someday, there will be a Palestinian state, and its capital will be in East Jerusalem, with the capital of Israel in West Jerusalem. We can then resolve this bizarre arrangement of having two diplomatic establishments in the Holy Land. We will have an American embassy in West Jerusalem, representing the United States in Israel, and we will have an American embassy in East Jerusalem, representing the United States in the capital of Palestine. Thank you very much.